I'm not going to start at the beginning. When we were starting the Butterfly Center, the first time that Jane came down, I brought her in to see Viola Espinosa. And we sat there and we're talking for like an hour or something like that. And Viola says, "Wow," she says, "you two, you're such a great pair." She says, "You guys complement each other so well." She says, "Jane, you are so nice." I met Jane in August 1972 when I was just starting out as a graduate student at Rice University. And Jane was a graduate student at Baylor College of Medicine. And her thesis advisor, who's here tonight, Mike Goff, also interacted with the person who was my thesis advisor, who was a guy named Charlie Stewart at Rice. And Jane ended up taking a seminar course, and I was in the class as well. And the very first day I was completely smitten with Jane.
During the break, he comes up and asks me a question, and I start to answer it, and he interrupts me asking another question, and I start to answer that one, and then he interrupts me a third time with another question. So I looked at him and I said, "Are you really interested in an answer to your questions, or do you just want to hear yourself talk?" And I turned around and walked away.
But nothing really happened. For one reason, Jane was married at the time. Jane was born in Selma, Alabama. Her parents, her mother's family had deep roots in Alabama and Tennessee. And in fact, the Wagoner part of her mother's family started the still that became Jack Daniel's Distillery today. Another branch of the family were the Yeagers, and again, some of you may have heard of a famous test pilot named Chuck Yeager, and he was a distant relative. Her father was in the military. He was Air Force. And so about every 3 years, they would move around the country, and that was just normal to Jane. So she lived all over. She lived in California, she lived in Texas, she lived in Georgia, she lived in Florida, she lived 3 times in Hawaii, she lived 2 long tours in England, which was her favorite, and she became a lifelong Anglophile. One of the things she did while she was in England was take ballet lessons very seriously. She loved the ballet then, and she loved the ballet the rest of her life. So her father was a meteorologist, but what Jane didn't know, or nor none of the sisters knew, was that that was really a cover for his real position, which was as second in command of communications for the forerunner of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He used to do things like parachute into Czechoslovakia and set up clandestine communication systems. When he would leave on his weekend trips all of the time, he would give her instructions on what to do if he didn't come back. The next year, there was another seminar course from Charlie Stewart, and I told Charlie, okay, I'm going to talk about the regulation of lysogeny in P22. And Charlie looked at me with a strange look on his face and said, "You do know that's what Jane Scott works on, don't you? You ought to go over there and talk to her." Other things were going on in her life, and the next year she and Randy Scott were divorced. And so really it was P22 that brought us together, and I'm always grateful for. It was around Christmas time of 1973, I guess, and we were seeing each other. Then Jane called the apartment I was living in. This was like maybe a month after we had started seeing each other, and a woman answered the phone, and it was a woman that was living in the apartment. There were like 3 bedrooms, and she wasn't living in my bedroom, and that just threw Jane into a rage. And she said, "That's it," you know. But I saw this book. This book had just come out about the New York City Ballet. Beautiful book. And I had bought it for Jane. So I took the book and I ran over to Baylor. It was a long way. I didn't have a car. And gave it to Jane and explained the situation, and we patched things up. Jane went to a small women's Baptist college in Alabama named Judson College. And Jane was raised Catholic, but yet, as Jane did everywhere, she fit in, had fun, made lifelong friends. The woman biology teacher was kind of a young, glamorous, independent woman, and that had a big effect on Jane. And Jane always was interested in biology and in living things. When she was a little girl, she would stuff horned toads, horned lizards into her pockets, and her mother would find them in the laundry. She found a dead skunk on the road, and she talked her parents into letting her put it in their freezer so she could dissect it. You might think, how would this girl talk her parents into putting this skunk in the freezer? And if you knew Jane, you kind of know it was really pointless to stand in her way when she wanted to do something. It just was of no use whatsoever. Jane and I both got our PhDs in 76. We were both leaving. And so we tried to figure out some place where we could both be in the same vicinity, and we were very fortunate. So I took a position at Stanford Biochemistry Department, and Jane got a position at University of California, San Francisco. We were there, I guess, for 3 or 4 years, and then we both found positions in New York City at Rockefeller University. We had a big adventure. We lived at Rockefeller University in the housing department in a building overlooking the East River, and our son, Matt, the first 6 months he was there, he was glued to the window, big picture window with a heliport below us, with ships coming back and forth and helicopters coming and seaplanes landing in the river. Jane was really a great mother. She loved our son, Matt Scott, fiercely. We have 2 grandchildren, Hunter Scott, Hayden Scott. Again, Jane was just a wonderful, wonderful grandmother. She was a good sister. Over the years, there were many occasions when things happened and her sisters needed help. When they were young, she tried to shield them from her mother. When they were older, if they needed financial help or other help, she was there. We moved from Rockefeller up to Chappaqua, New York, and our son, he was appalled because in the city, we probably went out for dinner, 4 or 5 nights a week. We were both working all the time. And we got to Chappaqua and looked around, and Matt said, we can't live here. And he was, he was 10 then. I said, well, why not? And he said, well, there's no place to eat. That was one thing. And it's not a friendly place. So why isn't it friendly? Well, it's all dark at night. Since I started a company, Jane thought one of us needed a real job. And so she took the job at Letterly. And she did incredibly well. She started out as a researcher and rose quickly through the ranks, eventually becoming senior director of vaccine development. So she traveled all over the place, all of the time. She went to Japan an awful lot, and she was very successful there. And I think part of the reason was there's a certain kind of similarity between Japanese culture and Southern U.S. culture in the kind of formality, in the kind of politeness, and understanding what the words really mean. When you say yes, you don't really mean yes, you mean I hear you, and so forth. And Jane intuitively got all of that. One time at this meeting, the Takeda people were on one side of the table, and the Letterly people are on the other side. And one of the Takeda guys, like the guy in charge of this project or something like that, starts talking, but he won't talk to Jane because she's a woman. And so he addresses his questions to Jane's second in command or something like that, and asks him these things. And finally, after this happens like 2 or 3 times, Jane smashes her fist on the table and says, when you want to ask a question, you address it to me, not to the person who works for me. If I had a question for you and addressed it to the people that work for you, that would not be acceptable. And so never do that again. And after that, I think the guy was taken off the case by the Takeda management, but also then the Takeda people referred to Jane as strong American woman. And things went well after that. Oftentimes Jane was close to the only woman around in these situations. There was still an awful lot of sexist attitudes and behavior. She faced continual advances by men. In a couple of cases, actual sexual assaults, like at Baylor, where I was going to go, punch out the guy, and Jane said that'd be the end of my career and wouldn't let me. So she had to put up with all of that while having a family life. Not only having a family life, but having family responsibilities. And yet she had the energy and the time to go ahead and succeed at all of this stuff, which really is extraordinary. Jane didn't care about money. But one thing she did like was, because she grew up in England, she always had this dream of owning a Jaguar. So when I sold the company, I bought this diamond and ruby ring for Jane. And the other thing I did is, as soon as we could afterwards, I bought her a Jaguar. It probably saved her life, actually, one time. It was like a tank. And one time a truck drove her off the road, actually going to work at Letterly, which is why we had to move closer. But she loved that car. Jane was instrumental in getting Letterly to purchase another pharmaceutical company called Praxis Biologicals. After they purchased Praxis, there was, I think it was a production facility headed by a guy who was Asian American, and I think grew up in China. He basically refused to report to Jane. The idea of reporting to a woman was something, his self-respect couldn't deal with it. Somehow, Jane was able to talk with him over and over again, bring him around slowly. And then by the time that Jane left Letterly, which I think was like 3 years after that or something like that, he gave her this beautiful, very large painting of butterflies that still hangs here at the house. So Jane just had a way of winning over people. After she left Letterly, she took a position as director of industrial liaisons, basically licensing, for New York University Medical School. And she did that for, 3, 4, 5 years. The commute was pretty brutal, and took a position very close to where we live here now. Then she left that, and with 2 other guys, she joined a small consulting licensing company called HVA. And then after that, she basically took over the North American Butterfly Association.
This is the best place in the whole United States to see butterflies every month of the year. I'm Jane Scott. I'm Secretary-Treasurer of the North American Butterfly Association. And we're here at our biggest project, the biggest project of the North American Butterfly Association. It's the National Butterfly Center here in the Valley, Texas. As you all who live here know, the weather is fantastic all year round. and butterflies love warm weather. There are almost 200 species that have been seen just right here in our own garden area. We have created a nursery which we propagate native plants that we use for our gardens here. This is a site that scientists who want to study the life cycles or the interactions of butterflies and their habitats can come and study. The monarchs are the ones that migrate, as probably almost everyone knows. They migrate all the way from Canada and throughout the US, down through Texas, through Florida, down into Mexico to their overwintering sites, and then their offspring come back through. So the habitat, the weather, and the connection with the land of Mexico all are the reasons that this is the place to come if you want to see a great butterfly or thousands of butterflies. You can come in December, you can come in January, every month of the year and find butterflies here, and the center will be open to welcome you.
We founded the North American Butterfly Association in the fall of 1992 while I was still at Columbia Law School. In the beginning, Jane was not all that much involved because she was working full-time. But as the organization grew, she took on more and more responsibilities. And we also traveled all over looking for butterflies. So, we went together to Ecuador and Venezuela and all through the United States. More and more people knew what Jane was doing. We had people in the chapters that she dealt with, and people would call here. We realized that the outcomes were always better if Jane picked up the phone than I did. The person would say, "Oh, I have a baby mother with a broken wing," and Jane would talk to them, and she'd go out of the room so she wouldn't disturb me. And an hour later, she'd have a new best friend, and that's really how Jane dealt with everyone. One of the things that I can say I'm actually really happy about is that forevermore, Jane and my name will be linked. And what I mean by that is a few years ago, I realized that a butterfly that people thought was the same kind of butterfly as another one wasn't, that it was a different species. We wrote a paper, and I wrote it with Bob Robbins, who's here today, and thank you very much, Bob. When you describe a new species, you get to give it a scientific name, and the scientific name I gave it, the genus is Mini-Strymon, I don't give it that name, but the species name was Jane Vicroy. And typically, in any kind of scientific publication, when you write out the name of an organism, like a butterfly, to write out its whole name, you would write the name, the genus, the species name, and then the name of the person who described the species. So in any scientific publication going forth, this butterfly is going to be referred to as Mini-Strymon Jane Vicroy Glassberg. Jane loved life. She loved people. She loved all aspects of life. She loved music. She loved dance. She loved art. She was interested in ideas. She was interested in accomplishing things, good things. She was interested in people. Jane would walk up to a stranger, a woman, and say, "I love your blouse," or "I love your pin," whatever. Just some complete stranger in some random setting. She just had a way of making everyone feel better about themselves.